Okay, let's resume our study in Revelation at chapter 7. The segment of Revelation that we're in the midst of began at chapter 4 and will end at chapter 8, verse 1. I intend to not only get to that point, but beyond that point in this session. This section is made up mainly of the breaking of the 7 seals on the scroll that was in the hand of him that was on the throne and which was handed to Christ, who was portrayed as a lamb, who then proceeded to break the seals. And as each individual seal was broken, we were introduced to something. Possibly we could see it as introduction to one of the characters or the players in the ensuing drama. But we saw that when the first 4 seals were broken, corresponding to each one of the first 4, there was a horseman that came out. And then the 5th seal revealed the martyrs' souls that were under the altar, asking how long it would be before vindication came, and they were told it would be a very short time. And the 6th seal had all these cosmic disturbances, which, if taken literally, would spell the end of the world. But since the same language that is found in chapter 6, verses 12 through 17, is found in many other places in the Bible, and generally not in what we would call a literal fashion, that is, it's symbolic language that is fairly common. There's very little in the book of Revelation that's completely original, really. I mean, it's just a regathering of imagery and symbols from other parts of the Bible, which are all put together here in a new way. But with the 6th seal, we have the events which I believe Jesus in the Olivet Discourse and on other occasions spoke of, which was predicting the fall of Jerusalem. At the very close of chapter 6, when the 6th seal had been broken, and about the time when you expect the 7th seal to be broken, since the first 6 were broken one right after another without delay, we do not have, at the point that we would expect it, the breaking of the 7th seal. That must be delayed until chapter 8, verse 1. In the meantime, we have chapter 7, which is the interlude. All action stops for the moment while we take a look at something of great importance. What is it that we see? Well, there are 144,000 Jewish people and an innumerable company of Gentile people that John sees here. And in fact, what I'd like to do is read the chapter and then comment as I understand the meaning to be. Remember, the closing line of chapter 6 was uttered by those who were suffering the calamity of the judgment, which they described as the wrath of the Lamb. And they said, who is able to stand? Well, quite obviously, if it is the Lamb who is wrathful, if it is the Lamb who is bringing judgment upon them, then those that would stand would be those who are on his side. We are first introduced in chapter 7 to the 144,000, although very little is said of them here. We find them mentioned again in chapter 14, and there they are seen with the Lamb, standing on Mount Zion. If you'll just look for a moment over at chapter 14. In verse 1 it says, Then I looked, and behold, a Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his Father's name written on their foreheads. So this will be the same group that we read of in chapter 7. In fact, the 144,000 of which we hear so much in prophetic discussions and in even the cults, the Jehovah's Witnesses and others have made an issue of this group because they consider it to be their own group. They're only mentioned twice in the Bible. Here in chapter 7 of Revelation, and then again briefly in chapter 14. And everything that is known of them can be deduced from these 2 passages, though there's not much. After these things I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, or on the sea, or on any tree. Then I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God, and he cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, Do not harm the earth, the sea, or the trees, until we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. And I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000. Of all the tribes of the children of Israel were sealed. Of the tribe of Judah, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Reuben, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Gad, 12,000 were sealed. And the tribe of Asher, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Naphtali, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Manasseh, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Simeon, 12,000 were sealed. And of the tribe of Levi, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Issachar, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Zebulun, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Joseph, 12,000 were sealed. And of the tribe of Benjamin, 12,000 were sealed. After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes and palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, saying, Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb. And all the angels stood around the throne, and the elders with the 4 living creatures, and fell on their faces before the throne, and worshipped God, saying, Amen. Blessing and glory and wisdom, thanksgiving and honor and power and might be to our God forever and ever. Amen. Then one of the elders answered, saying to me, Who are these arrayed in white robes? And where did they come from? And I said to him, Sir, you know. So he said to me, These are the ones who come out of the Great Tribulation. Who have come out. No, who come out. Actually, in the Greek, it's who are coming out of the Great Tribulation. Excuse me. The Greek tense is in the present tense. They are coming out of the Great Tribulation. Present progressive or whatever. So it is happening at the time that John is seeing this vision. There are people coming out of this, or at least before his eyes it is happening in the vision. Therefore they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will dwell among them. They shall neither hunger any more nor thirst any more. The sun shall not strike them nor any heat. For the Lamb who is in the midst of the throne will shepherd them and lead them to the fountains of living waters, or fountains of waters, living fountains of waters. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And then in chapter 8, verse 1, when he opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about a half hour. And something else begins to happen then. Now, this interlude is given to answer, as I said, the question, who is going to be able to stand? There are 2 groups of people that John sees. They are distinct from each other in 2 particulars. The first group is large but numbered, 144,000. The second group is larger still and innumerable. No one could number them, it says in verse 9. So this is a difference between the 2 groups. You've got 144,000 in the first group and an innumerable amount in the second. The other distinction is that the first group are said to be of the tribes of Israel, whereas the second group are said to be of all nations, tribes, peoples, tongues, and so forth. So this is principally the way we would designate these as 2 separate groups. The theories on this are numerous. As I said, even the Jehovah's Witnesses think that their leaders, the ones they call the anointed ones, are the 144,000. Other cults have tried to identify their group as the 144,000. Usually not accepting at face value the reference to them being Israelites. After all, sometimes in the Bible, Israel is a term that is used for the church, or for God's people generally, regardless of their race. The church is sometimes called the Israel of God, the true Israel. And so there are those who would say, these are not literally Jews, they are simply the Israel of God, they're the church, the overcomers or whatever. I even know some progressive parallelists who take this view. They understand both of these groups to be essentially 2 different ways of viewing the church. The 144,000 representing the church as the Israel of God, and the other group representing the church as an international body. The church is both, and therefore there are 2 visions to convey the notion of the dual nature of the church. I reject this interpretation simply because it seems like John has gone out of his way to make a distinction between the 2 groups. They are not 2 ways of talking about the same group of people. The number is different as well as the nationality. Now, the most commonly heard teaching on this would seem to be that these are Jewish people, 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes, who will be converted after the rapture of the church. This is what the dispensational teaching is. That the church will be raptured, the 7-year tribulation will commence, and in the tribulation there will be a remnant of Israel that shall be saved, and their number shall be 144,000. Now, there's really not too much told about these 144,000, but some dispensationalists have gone quite at length to explain what these people will be doing. They say, for example, that these will be Jewish evangelists. In fact, Hal Lindsey identified them as 144,000 Jewish Billy Grahams, he said. He said, imagine what impact it would have on the world if with 144,000 Jewish Billy Grahams running around. I don't know where he saw the Billy Grahams in here. I just see it said that they were sealed, that they are with the Lamb, they are Jewish. Not much is said about them here except that they break down into 12 groups of 12,000 each from the 12 tribes of Israel. Nonetheless, the dispensationalists have the view that this is the last group of Jews to be saved in history during the tribulation period. And some go so far as to say that they will be so effective in evangelizing the world that they will be more effective in 7 years evangelizing the world than the church has been in 2,000 years on the project. Well, in order to understand who these people are, we should look at both passages because each passage has so little information about them that by combining the two passages and putting the information together, we can probably have our best shot at understanding what we're looking at here. If you look at chapter 14, it's just in the first 5 verses that we see the 144,000 again, but we get some more information about them that will be helpful in determining who it is we're seeing. John said, "Then I looked, and behold, a Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 having his Father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven like the voice of many waters," that is the way Jesus' voice was described in the first chapter, "and like the voice of loud thunder. And I heard the sound of harpists playing their harps. And they sang as it were a new song before the throne, before the 4 living creatures and the elders. And no one could learn that song except the 144,000 who were redeemed from the earth. And these are the ones who were not defiled with women, for they are virgins. These are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These were redeemed from among men, being firstfruits to God and to the Lamb. And in their mouth was found no guile, for they are without fault before the throne of God." Now, there are several things told us about them in this chapter. In chapter 7, we read only that they were Jewish from the 12 tribes of Israel. Here we have some additional information. For example, one of the things we're told is that they follow the Lamb wherever he goes. Since the Lamb in the book of Revelation is Christ, it means they're followers of Christ. They're disciples. They're Christians, in other words. They're Jewish Christians. That still doesn't narrow it down very much, but that's one thing we learn about them. They are Jewish Christians. The first thing we're told is that they don't defile themselves with women. They're virgins. This can hardly be a reference to physical virginity or literal virginity. For one thing, throughout the book of Revelation, harlotry or prostitution or adultery is usually a reference to spiritual activity of the harlot. Babylon is called the mother of harlots and so forth. And the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her. No scholar I've ever heard of could suggest that this is talking about the physical sexual activity. It has to do with spiritual compromise. In Old Testament times, when Israel was considered God's wife, whenever Israel worshipped idols, God accused her of committing spiritual adultery, because she was supposed to worship only God, her husband, and if she worshipped another god, it was like a woman going after another man. And so adultery of the nation of Israel was the term that was used for idolatry. In the book of Revelation, we see Babylon, the mother of harlots, in chapter 17, who has filled the earth with her harlotry. And probably we're to understand that these are people who have not participated in the spiritual defilement of women. That is not of real women, but of harlots. They have not involved themselves in spiritual adultery. Now, on the other hand, if we wanted to say they are physically virgins, there'd be a certain problem to this. If this was suggesting that the only Jewish believers who were going to be saved were virgins in the physical sense of the word, then that would enforce virginity, literal virginity, as a condition of salvation. And yet Paul, in writing to Timothy, said, in the last days men would arise teaching doctrines of demons, as he called it, 1 Timothy chapter 4. And among those things that he said were doctrines of demons, 1 Timothy 4:3 says, forbidding to marry, and commanding to abstain from foods which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. So among those that would teach doctrines of demons would be those who forbid to marry. Now, if we believed that to be a part of this 144,000 you had to be literally a virgin, it would mean you basically would have to forbid to marry. And that is what Paul calls the doctrine of demons. It cannot be that John is teaching here what Paul would call a doctrine of demons, namely enforced virginity. So I think, are better off understanding this virginity in the context of Revelation and the harlotry, the spiritual adultery. These Jews are Christian Jews, and they are not participating in the worship of the beast. They're not participating in the harlotry of the nation in general. Yes?
And also say that they were all men who were not defiled. Well, not necessarily, but they were ones who were not defiled with women.
Right.
Where did that say that they are all men?
That would suggest that only male Jews would be saved. Right. If we're taking that in the most literal sense. Right. Okay. And then, in addition to following the Lamb, it says they are redeemed from among men. Now, that isn't, again, very narrowing, because we've already discovered they were Christians. They follow the Lamb, and Christians are redeemed. So that's simply stating that God has bought these people. The word redeem means bought back. He's bought them from the world of humanity. Yes?
It seems that I've heard this 144,000 is not being those who are saved, but the saved ones, the elect ones who are going to be chosen, like what you said, to build grounds and whatever. So...
Well, I don't know that I've ever heard it taught like that, except, like I said, the Jehovah's Witnesses do teach that. The Jehovah's Witnesses believe that more than 144,000 will be saved, but they believe that only the 144,000 will actually be in heaven. They believe the other saved Jehovah's Witnesses will be on the new earth, and that the 144,000 will reign over the others. So they are like a privileged class of saved individuals in what the Jehovah's Witnesses teach. I don't know that I've ever heard any Christian teachers saying that, a counterpart to that, but there might be some who do, and you might have heard it. I don't think that's a very common teaching, but that there's all kinds of, individual interpretations that people give of things, and so I couldn't deny that you may have heard something like that. But anyway, these, I think we'd have to say, are uncompromising Christians, and they are redeemed by Christ, redeemed by God for Himself. Now, here's something very interesting. At the end of verse 4 it says, being first fruits to God and to the Lamb. Now, this is helpful, because the first fruits were the beginning of the harvest. The first harvested grain were the first fruits of the harvest. The church age is, in one sense, a harvest. Jesus said, the harvest indeed is plenteous and the laborers are few. Pray to the Lord of harvest that He may send more laborers to the harvest, referring to the ingathering of people into the church. The first fruits would be those who chronologically came in first, were the first harvested ones. Now, in that case, it would point in the direction of early Jewish Christians, not later Jewish Christians. If we're talking about people who are going to rise up during some future tribulation, the last Jews to be saved in history, then he should have called them the last fruits, not the first fruits. The term first fruits points us into a particular time period. And that would be the first century, when the first converts were made. Now, let's pause for a moment there and look over at James chapter 1. James chapter 1 and verse 1. He tells us who his audience is. James, the servant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. In other words, Jews. Apparently believing Jews. The evidence from within the book is that his audience is principally made up of believing Jews. Now, later in the same chapter, in verse 18, James 1:18, excuse me, he says, of his own will he brought us forth, that is, James and his readers, the believing Jews of the first century, by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Now, James identifies himself and his fellow Jewish Christians of the first century as chosen by God to be the first fruits of God. And that's sensible. All the first Christians were Jewish. Jesus was a Jew. The 12 apostles were Jewish. The 120 in the upper room who got filled with the Spirit on the day of Pentecost were Jews, all. The 3,000 who were converted on the day of Pentecost were all Jewish. When the number swelled to 5,000 a few days later, apparently, in Acts chapter 3, they were all Jewish too. Jewish believers. Jewish followers of the Lamb. All the first fruits were. In fact, for many years, I shouldn't say many years, for a number of years, we don't know how many, for a certain number of years after Jesus died and rose again, all the converts to Christianity were Jews. And we lose track of the numbers after the number reached 5,000, but that was just a few days after Pentecost. In the following years, with the spread of Christianity, with the Lord adding to the church daily, as such as should be saved, it is not unreasonable to assume that the number of Jewish believers swelled to perhaps tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, before a single Gentile was admitted into the church. Remember, it took some time for the Jewish believers to realize that the Gentiles would be admitted into the church. They thought that if a Gentile wanted to become a Christian, he had to first become a Jew. He had to become circumcised and so forth. And in which case he wasn't considered a Gentile anymore, but a Jew. They believed only Jews could be saved, and so they only evangelized deliberately Jews for a long time, until God opened Peter's eyes at the household of Cornelius when God poured out His Spirit on a group of Gentiles, the first ones to receive the baptism of the Spirit. And then it became known in the church that the Gentiles were going to be acceptable. Shortly after that, Paul was out evangelizing Gentiles in great numbers. And eventually, the number of Gentiles that has come in has been innumerable. Now, the first Christians, therefore, or the first fruits of the harvest, were Jews, all Jews. We don't know the exact number of Jews who were converted prior to the beginning of Gentiles coming in, and the number doesn't even have to be known. It could easily have approached 144,000 or maybe have even exceeded that number. The important thing is not whether it was exactly that number or not. To my mind, the number is symbolic anyway. The number 12 is a symbolic number. Stands for the people of God, generally speaking, and I think that what we have here is a symbolic number which is large enough to convey the notion of a very large company of Jews who were the first ones to be converted by the Lamb, to follow the Lamb. They were the first fruits to God and to the Lamb. That would be the Christians of the first century who were Jewish, and principally those who comprised what came to be called the church in Jerusalem. By the way, the last thing we're told about them, or the last two things, in Revelation 14:5, says, "In their mouth was found no guile," which means dishonesty, "and they are without fault before the throne of God." Well, all Christians are without fault before the throne of God. But "in their mouth was found no guile" is an interesting statement, because that's precisely what the same author, John, recorded Jesus as saying about Nathanael when he saw Nathanael coming to him. In John chapter 1, John 1 and verse 47, Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said to him, "Behold, an Israelite indeed." In other words, one of the true remnant, one of the true Israelites, "in whom is no guile." The very qualification for being a true Israelite. One would have to be not only a Jew by birth, but also to be an honest person, to be a true man like Jacob, a true man of Israel. And it's interesting that this which Jesus characterized as setting Nathanael apart from the rank and file of Israelites, who for the most part were hypocrites in those days, he saw him as one of the true remnant. And what happened to Nathanael? He became a disciple. He became one of the Jewish believers of the first century. This is what all the 144,000 became. Jewish believers of the first century. They had this characteristic too. There was no guile in their mouths. Unlike the Pharisees, who were inveterate liars and hypocrites, the true believers in Jesus Christ were Jews who were honest, who were not deceivers, who were committed to truth. Not like those that Jesus said were of their father the devil, who is a liar and the father of lies. Jesus basically made a distinction in Israel between those on the one hand who opposed him, who he said were the children of the devil and following the father of lies, and those who were true Israelites, who were honest, who were seekers after truth, who were committed to truth, and who became disciples of his. And they became what we call the early church. Now, people can interpret the data differently if they wish, but I don't see how they can. It seems to me especially that the reference to them as the first fruits in chapter 14 and verse 4 of Revelation, more than any of the other identifying marks that are given, points to the time frame of when they lived. They were early, not late converts to Christianity. They're not at the end of the age, they're in the beginning of the age. Now, if we go back to Revelation 7, what is our context? Our context is the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And those who are falling under that wrath are saying, who's going to survive this? And the answer is given, these guys are. These are Jews. Many of them were inhabitants of the actual city of Jerusalem, these believing Christians. There was a church there. But they did not die in that wrath. I've pointed out to you before that an early Christian historian named Eusebius, usually regarded as the first Christian historian apart from Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, Eusebius wrote his ecclesiastical history in the year 300. He says that just prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, an oracle or a prophetic word was given to the church in Jerusalem, the believers there. And they left the city, all of them. Every last Christian left. And when Jerusalem was then besieged by Titus, there was not one Christian left inside. They fled across the Jordan River to a place in Transjordania called Pella, and there they were preserved. They were immune from the wrath of the Lamb when it came down on the city of Jerusalem. Nothing could fit more perfectly this particular passage. We have what I have argued in chapter 6, a description of the judgment on Jerusalem. The question of who will survive it is answered in chapter 7, the 144,000 of first fruits. That is, whatever their actual number was, symbolically, the full number of believing Jews. The Jews who had turned to Christ, who were followers of the Lamb, they became the first fruits of God and of, and of the Lamb. And that's what James even calls the believing Jews of his own day, the first fruits to God. Now, verse 9 then, I really skipped over some things I shouldn't skip over. Let's just look at some of those early verses in chapter 7. After these things I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth. Now, could be the land. The 4 corners of the land. In fact, more likely, since the earth doesn't have any corners, but the land did. The land had boundaries. You could identify the corners of the land of Israel. But you couldn't identify the corners of the earth since it's round. And the Bible does not teach that the earth is not round. So, some say that this is depicting Israel as God's 4-cornered altar. You know, the altars in the sanctuary had 4 corners with horns on the corners, to which the sacrifice was tied when it was sacrificed. But it's unclear whether he's really comparing Israel to an altar where a sacrifice is going to be made. At any rate, there are 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the land, holding the 4 winds of the land, or of the earth, could be either one, that the wind should not blow on the earth, or the land, or the sea, or on any tree. Since the word earth is contrasted with sea, land would seem to be the translation. Since the sea is part of the earth, if we're talking about the globe, the planet Earth, but is contrasted with the land. And so the wind would not blow on the land, or on the sea, or on any tree. Now, as the plagues begin to happen, especially the trumpet judgments, and the bowl judgments of wrath, we'll find that the land and the sea and the trees are all affected negatively. But before any of this happens, there is a command, don't do anything. Hold everything. Don't release any of these judgments until I have sealed the servants of God on their forehead. That's in verse 3. Now this picture of sealing them on their foreheads comes from Ezekiel chapter 9. Which was in a parallel kind of situation. Ezekiel is predicting the destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Babylonians. An exactly parallel situation to this. But in the vision that Ezekiel had in chapter 9, the entire chapter 9 of Ezekiel is taken up with this vision. He saw 6 men who were given charge over the city. They were probably angels. And they were called by God to come forward. And each one came forward having a weapon of execution in his hand, a sword. And they were the 6 executioners of the city of Jerusalem. And he said, I saw another man with an inkhorn, a pen and an inkhorn, and he was commanded to go through Jerusalem and take his inkhorn and put a mark on the forehead of everyone in Jerusalem who sighed and cried over the abominations done in that city. And so the man with the inkhorn went and he put a mark on the forehead of all those who shared God's concerns, those who were not pleased with the sins of the city, those who were righteous at heart. They received this mark on their foreheads. And then, after the mark was placed, according to Ezekiel 9, the 6 executioners were sent in to begin slaughtering everybody else except those who had the mark on them. Now that is obviously the exact same concept we have here. The images, the numbers are a little different. Instead of 6 executioners, we have 4 angels who are holding back the 4 winds at the 4 corners of the land. But it's clear that they are, when they release those 4 winds, they're releasing judgment on Jerusalem. But they're not to do that until, as also in Ezekiel, the servants of God who are in Jerusalem, the true Christians in Jerusalem, the Jewish believers, are marked. Now this mark should not be thought to be literal any more than it was in Ezekiel's day. Ezekiel saw this all in a vision. There wasn't really an angel going around putting a visible mark on people's faces. And we shouldn't think that is the case here either. The idea is that God has His brand visibly upon His people. And that brand is what saves them. Just like in the Exodus, a very similar concept. In the Exodus, God is going to send the death angel through to destroy the firstborn of every house. But every house that had the blood, like a mark, on the lintels and the doorposts of the house, when the mark was seen, the death angel would pass over and not harm the inhabitants of the house. A similar concept. God first goes through and makes sure that all of His real people are marked, as it were. It can be literal or non-literal. In the case of the Exodus, it was a literal blood on the door. In the case of Ezekiel, it was symbolic. The idea is, however, that God has already made a distinction before He sends or releases any judgment. He's already made a clear distinction between His people and those who are not His people. And He will not destroy the righteous with the wicked. Remember when God was going to destroy Sodom and Abraham said, will you destroy also the righteous with the wicked? Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And God finally agreed that if He found 10 righteous in the city, He'd not only not kill those 10 righteous, He'd spare the whole city. Showing that His grace was far more abundant than even what Abraham asked. But the point here is, God will do right. He will never send judgment indiscriminately. Even when the plagues came upon Egypt, it says several times that in the land of Goshen where the Israelites were, there was no darkness, there were no gnats, there were no plagues. Because God said to Pharaoh, I make a distinction between Israel and Egypt. God always does make a distinction between His people and the world, and when He sends judgment on the world, His people will not participate in it, will not partake of it. In this case, when God was sending judgment on Jerusalem in AD 70, He first made provision for His people to be delivered. Now, He didn't literally put an ink mark on their forehead. This is a symbolic way of saying that they were selected, singled out by God for deliverance, to be spared. A little later, for example, in chapter 9, when we see these scorpion-like locusts being released on the land, in chapter 9, verse 4, it says, they were commanded not to harm the grass nor the earth, nor any green thing, nor any tree, but only those men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. So the plagues came only on those who did not have the seal of God on their foreheads. Now this is interesting because even those who believe that we are reading here about a future tribulation period at the end of the age, and many people understand the book of Revelation that way, would have to acknowledge that there's no need for the church to be removed. See, there are some people who say, well, God has not appointed us to wrath, therefore He's got to rapture the church before the Great Tribulation because that's the wrath of God, and He doesn't want us to experience the wrath of God, so He'll have to rapture the church. Not so. Even if we allowed that this was a future Great Tribulation, which I do not believe, still we see that the believers are in the world. The believers are they're not gone to heaven. They are spared judgment. The judgments that are sent are not poured out on the ones that have the mark or the seal of God on their forehead. By the way, later on in chapter 13, we'll read about those who have the mark of the beast on their forehead or on their hand. And while many people who are futurists in their approach tend to make this a literal tattoo that some future Antichrist is going to put on us, fact of the matter is I think it's more realistic to translate this or interpret this the same way we interpret the mark of God, the seal of God on the forehead. It's not a visible, literal mark. It is something God alone sees. But God knows who are His and who belong to the enemy. And symbolically referred to those who have the mark of God or the seal of God on the one hand on their forehead. And on the other hand, those who have the mark of the beast on their foreheads or on their hands. Now, their number is given here. They are sealed by God for survival. We know historically that the Christian Jews, the first fruits of the church, did survive this Holocaust. They actually escaped, which is what this is predicting. I don't see how any other scenario can better fit the material than this. Then, in verse 9, we read of the second group of people. After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues. Obviously, these things are said in order to point out to us this is a different group. This is an international group. This is the innumerable number of Gentiles who come into the church after the first fruits. The concept is obvious to us looking back in history. The first many thousands of Christians were Jews, but after that, an overwhelmingly larger majority came from all nations, kindreds, people, and tongues. In other words, the larger part of the church is certainly not Jewish ethnically. And so that's what we're reading here. And they were crying with a loud voice, saying, salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb. And all the angels stood around the throne, and the elders and the four living creatures, and fell on their faces before the throne of God, and worshipped. We read these words earlier. But then one of the elders says to John in verse 13, who are these people in the white robes? Sometimes Ezekiel was asked questions like that. He saw these dry bones out in the valley, and the angel said, can those bones live? And Ezekiel said, is this a trick question? They don't look like they can live, but I'll bet you're not asking me that to get the obvious answer. And he says, oh Lord, you know. He wouldn't say whether he knew or not. He just said, the angel said, can these bones live? He said, oh, you know, Lord. Well, John wisely speaks the same way. The elder says, where did these people come from? Who are these people in white robes? And he said, sir, you know. So he said to me, these are the ones who are coming out of the Great Tribulation and have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Now, as soon as we see that people have made their robes white by washing them in blood, it should tip you off that we're reading highly symbolic description of something, because blood is not a whitening agent. Furthermore, the blood of the Lamb does not exist in some basin somewhere where you can go wash your clothes in it. It's talking about their character. It's talking about their life as their robes. Later on, as I pointed out in a previous lecture on this, in chapter 19, we're told that the bride was given clean, white raiment to wear. And it says, and the white linen that she wore is the righteous deeds, the righteous acts of the saints. Clothing here is symbolic for behavior or life or character. These are people whose character has been cleansed. Their lives are clean now because of the blood of Jesus. Once again, although we commonly use the language, are you washed in the blood and so forth, we should understand that even that is a metaphor. We know that Jesus' blood is what cleanses from all sins, but it's not by actually taking a bath in the liquid blood. It's rather a figurative way of talking about the effect of the cleansing of our souls that takes place because Jesus shed his blood. The result of his having died as a sacrifice for us is that we stand now clean, and figuratively it can be said we were washed in his blood, but not to be taken overly literally. And now, that being the case, we have to guard against being over literal in our understanding of some of these things. When it says these are the ones who came out of or are coming out of the Great Tribulation, we might first of all say, what is the Great Tribulation? Well, in all likelihood, the Great Tribulation is the Great Tribulation of which Jesus spoke. The expression, the Great Tribulation, though it's very common in modern books on eschatology, is not very common in the Bible. The first time you read of it is in Matthew 24 from Jesus, in verse 21, Matthew 24:21, when Jesus said, for then there will be great tribulation. The next time we encounter this expression, after Jesus, is here in Revelation 7, in verse 14. These have come out of the Great Tribulation. When it says the Great Tribulation, it tells us that it's not just talking about general tribulation. Tribulation is a general term for trouble. And everybody goes through trouble. Everybody goes through tribulation of some kind or another. But it says the Great Tribulation, as if to use that as a technical term for a particular time of tribulation. And since it is Jesus and only Jesus, who previously used that term, then shall be great tribulation. I think we should best understand that this is that great tribulation of which Jesus spoke, that these people come out from. Now, this would be supported, of course, also from the fact that Jesus made the statement in the Olivet Discourse. And this statement is in Revelation, which tends to be an expanded version of the Olivet Discourse. Same subject matter, same things found in it, only this is much more elaborate than the Olivet Discourse. So, if Jesus mentioned great tribulation in the Olivet Discourse, and Revelation says these are the ones coming out of that, or the great tribulation, well, I think we should say it's the tribulation of which Jesus spoke. But what tribulation is that? While we don't have time to go back over the Olivet Discourse as we did in detail earlier, I would remind you that the great tribulation of which Jesus spoke was to happen shortly after Jerusalem was surrounded by armies. The way it reads in Luke 21 is, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that her desolation is near. Then you who are in Judea flee to the wilderness. You who are on the housetops, don't go down to get any clothing. You who are in the fields, don't go back into the city. He said, for then shall be great, but in Matthew he said, then shall be great tribulation. In Luke he says, then shall be great distress on this land and wrath upon this people. Obviously, localizing it to Israel and to the Jews. And that is in Luke 21, the statement that parallels Matthew's statement about then shall be great tribulation. So Jesus was talking about the great hardship coming upon this land, Israel, these people, the wrath upon these people, he said, which was the Jews. And it would happen shortly after Jerusalem was besieged by armies. So we have a time frame for that. Looking back in history, we know that was the AD 70 this took place. Therefore, we have reason to believe that the Great Tribulation here is the same Great Tribulation of which Jesus spoke, and we've got, again, 70 AD in view in Revelation chapter 7. Now, the question, of course, can naturally arise, in what sense did hundreds of millions or innumerable company of Gentiles come up out of that tribulation? And I guess it depends on how we understand these are the ones coming out of that tribulation. If it means they were killed in that tribulation and have now come up into heaven, come out of the earth into heaven, then that would present some problems, because certainly there were more Jews than Gentiles killed in that great Holocaust. There were some Gentiles who were, of course, but they weren't necessarily Christian Gentiles. I think the way we should understand it is that as the result of this tribulation, there is going to be a great multitude of Gentiles converted. When Christianity was centered around the temple, around Judaism, which it was for the first 40 years of its history, it did not have so great an attraction to Gentiles as afterwards, when it became clearly a movement that was largely Gentile in nature. Many Gentiles, unfortunately, had prejudice against Jews. The Jews had not always acted in such a way as to endear Gentiles to them. And as long as Christianity was somewhat viewed as a Jewish sect, no doubt the number of Gentiles who wished to be a part of it was somewhat limited. But we know that the greater part of Gentile evangelism began after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, when Christianity was clearly seen as independent of Judaism, as largely a Gentile movement. Now, we know there were Gentiles, and a good number of them converted before 70 AD. Paul was doing his evangelism, planting Gentile churches before 70 AD. But we don't have any figures. We don't have any numbers. We read of him planting churches, but we don't know how big they were. In Athens, for example, when Paul preached, we're given the names of about 4 or 5 people who followed him and believed his gospel. In Corinth, there was a church, but we don't know what size, but Paul said that this man Gaius was the host of the entire church in town. That is, his house was probably the meeting place of the church, so it must have been a small enough church to meet in a man's home. It is probable that when we read about the churches that Paul founded, they were really a pretty small group. But we don't know, we don't really have figures on that. We do know, however, that the world of Gentiles began to be evangelized in earnest and in a big way when the church was scattered throughout the world after 70 AD and was no longer centered around the temple and its things. So in saying that this great multitude has come up out of the Great Tribulation, my thought is, and you're certainly welcome to reject it in favor of a better theory if you have one, my thought is that it's simply saying that as the result of this tribulation, coming out of this event, there is going to be, and is already happening, an influx of an enormous number of Gentiles. Altogether, when their whole number is brought in, there will really be untold numbers, multitudes of them. And that has been the case. Now, describing these people further, in verse 15 it says, they are before the throne of God and serve Him day and night in His temple. Lest we think this means they've gone to heaven. I don't think it necessarily does mean that. The temple of God in the New Testament is always the church. The Apostle Paul says to the church, know you not that you are the temple of God. In Hebrews it says, Christ is the Lord over His own house, whose house you are, you Christians. Paul says that the church is built on the foundation of apostles and prophets and grows into a holy temple in the Lord, spiritually speaking. Peter says we are living stones being built up into a spiritual house, that is a temple. Whether you consult Paul, Peter, the writer of Hebrews, or any other New Testament source, the temple in the New Testament is the church. By the way, even in John's other writings, in the Gospel of John, we have a hint of this very early on in John chapter 2, when Jesus says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will build it up again. The Jews mistakenly thought he meant the Jewish temple, but he already had a new concept of what the temple was. Although he had not yet established the church, he already in his own speaking was shifting the concept of the temple from the Jewish temple to what? His body. John says he spoke of the temple of his body. Today his body is the church, the body of Christ. His body is the temple. And therefore, I'll wait for you to do that if you like. Therefore, to say they serve God in His temple is simply to say they're members of the church. They are serving God, no doubt, on the earth. Before the throne of God, yes, we come before the throne of God consciously every time we pray, and unconsciously we always live our lives before Him, under His sovereignty. I don't see this as necessarily saying these people have gone up into heaven yet, though, of course, a great number have by now. But in John's day, most of them had not yet even been converted when he saw this vision. And He who sits on the throne will dwell among them. That is, Jesus made that promise, which John also recorded in John 14. In John 14, I think it's verse 23, Jesus said, he that has my commandments and keeps them, well, let me read it here and there. John 14:21 says, he who has my commandments and keeps them, it is he who loves me. And he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him. And then 2 verses later, in verse 23, John 14:23 says, Jesus answered and said to him, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. So the promise of Christ, recorded by John in his Gospel, is that whoever loves Jesus and keeps His commandments, He and the Father come and make their home with us. It's not a reference to us going to heaven to make our home with Him. He comes to us and makes His home among us. The temple of the Holy Spirit, the church, is His home. It is the house in which He resides today. And therefore, when it says, He who sits on the throne will dwell among them, it's entirely in keeping with what Jesus said would happen among Christians. But that's in this life. They shall neither hunger anymore, Revelation 7:16 says, they shall neither hunger anymore nor thirst anymore. Now this statement, no doubt, is not absolutely literal. Jesus said, blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. They shall be satisfied. And probably we're not talking about physical hunger here. They have their hunger filled. Why do I say not physical? Because for one thing, it says in verse 17, the Lamb who is in the midst of the throne will shepherd them. Like a shepherd leads his flocks out to the pasture, they don't have to be hungry anymore. He'll take them to green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He makes me lie down in green pastures, Psalm 23 says. Jesus in John again, chapter 10, said, I am the good shepherd of the sheep. And He goes out before His sheep and He leads them like a good shepherd to pasture. That's why they're not hungry. They are satisfied with what He provides for their nourishment, spiritually speaking. And He also says here in verse 17, and lead them to living fountain of waters. Now that comes right out of the Gospel of John too. In John chapter 7, the woman at the well was told by Jesus, he who drinks this water of this well will thirst again, but the water that I give him, if they drink it, they will never thirst. And I'll give you water of life, living water. Well, here's the echo of that here. It says in verse 16, they shall thirst not anymore. They will not thirst anymore. The very same thing Jesus said would happen to a person who puts his faith in Him, and to the woman of the well. And He's going to lead to fountains of living water. So the hungering and the thirsting is figurative. It has to do with spiritual hunger, spiritual thirst. And it is satisfied by the shepherd who leads us spiritually into green pastures and leads us to fountains of living waters. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And once again, this should not be taken too literally any more than the rest of the imagery should. The hunger and the thirst are not literal, and the tears are not literal. Actually, Christians do cry sometimes. Christians do have sorrow and disappointments. But Jesus said, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. He wipes away all the tears from their eyes. That doesn't mean they don't have any more tears, but when they do, He wipes them. He comforts those who mourn. The Christian has the comfort of Christ in his trials, in his mourning. You know, Paul said in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, as he was writing about the resurrection of believers, he said, I think it's in verse 13, somewhere around there, 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul says, brethren, I don't want you to be ignorant about those who've died, those who've fallen asleep in Christ, lest you should be sorrowful as others who have no hope. And then he tells about the resurrection of Christ, or the resurrection of the believers, and then he says, wherefore comfort one another with these words. You see, Christians are sorry when they lose loved ones too. But they're not sorry like others who have no hope. There's a world of difference. In fact, I can't imagine how others who have no hope endure at all the loss of loved ones. I just can't imagine unbelievers who lose a baby, or lose a husband or a wife, or whose parents die. I just don't know how they cope, because they have no hope. But Christians don't sorrow like that. If I lost a child or my wife or something, I'd certainly sorrow. I sorrowed when my previous wife was killed. But not like those who have no hope. She was a Christian, and I was comforted. You know, I mean, by God. Jesus wipes away the tears from our eyes. Doesn't mean there's never going to be any more disappointments or sorrows. But at least we don't have to go through them alone. He's there to do that. Now, I skipped over the statement at the end of verse 16, the sun shall not strike them, nor any heat. Actually, I don't know what this refers to exactly, but the language is directly from the Old Testament. It again has to do with God's overarching protection. In Isaiah chapter 49:10, it says, and they shall neither hunger nor thirst, neither heat nor sun shall strike them. For he who has mercy on them will lead them. Even by the springs of water he will guide them. Obviously, the statement in Revelation is just a reworking of that statement in Isaiah 49:10. There's reference to hungry and thirsting. There's reference to being smitten by the sunstroke. There's reference to being led by springs of water. Very clearly, the language of Isaiah 49:10 is simply reworked in the verse in Revelation. It is not quoted exactly, as no verse in the Old Testament is exactly quoted in Revelation. But you can hardly miss the connection there. It speaks of God basically keeping you safe. Apparently, you know, in Israel, and especially the shepherds out on the hillsides where there weren't a lot of trees in the heat of the day, no doubt they often suffered sunstroke, or the sheep might have even suffered exhaustion or something out in the heat. But here, this shepherd, he cares for his sheep in such a way that they don't suffer sunstroke. Elsewhere, the Bible talks about us dwelling in the shadow of the Almighty, or under the shadow of His hand. The idea being that He's protecting us from the elements, protecting us from dangers. And so, here, these Gentiles, this great number of Gentiles who become converted as a result of the Gentile mission that received tremendous impetus after Jerusalem fell. These are described in this way. They are the flock. They're Jesus' flocks of sheep. Notice he describes these Gentiles as sheep following the Lamb. He will shepherd them. Remember again, John said this in John chapter 10. Jesus said, I have other sheep that you don't know about, meaning Gentiles, because the Jewish believers didn't know about the Gentiles coming in yet. And Jesus said, John chapter 10 and verse 16, other sheep I have which are not of this fold. They're not Jews. Them also I must bring, and they will hear my voice, and there will be one flock and one shepherd. So Jesus revealed in John 10:16, but not as clearly as the disciples needed to understand it, that Gentiles will become part of His flock too. And the same writer who recorded that statement of Jesus records this, that this innumerable company of Gentiles, having become Christians, are part of his flock. They're part of his one flock and his one fold. Now, we come to chapter 8. And we see the seventh seal broken. When he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about a half hour. And that surprises us because we've been expecting this from this great build-up. If when the sixth seal was broken, the sun and the moon and the stars disappeared, earthquake shook away all the islands and mountains. If that happened in the sixth seal, what could we expect from the seventh? Silence. Silence for about a half hour. But in that silence, certain actions are played out. Verse 2, and I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets. Then another angel, having a golden censer, came and stood at the altar. A censer was used for burning incense in the tabernacle and later in the temple. And now this is in heaven. And he was given much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints ascended before God from the angel's hand. Then the angel took the censer, the same one in which he burned incense, and filled it with fire from the altar where he had burned the incense, and threw it, the fire, to the earth. And there were noises, thunderings, lightnings, and an earthquake. Phenomena that recur frequently in the book of Revelation. So the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. Well, now we've broken into the third segment of Revelation. It starts at verse 2 and runs through chapter 11, most of chapter 11. This, unlike the previous segment, which was characterized by 7 seals being broken, this is characterized by the blowing of 7 trumpets. As in the previous case, we're going to see 6 of the trumpets blown in rapid succession. And then there's going to be an interlude, a long one, and then the 7th trumpet will be blown at the end of chapter 11, and we'll end that segment. Now, we have begun, therefore, another segment. As in the previous 2, there is an opening vision, a heavenly one. The vision is of an angel offering incense in heaven before God. Now, this is highly symbolic. Perhaps this is why the silence is in heaven. The custom of the Jews on a regular basis was to burn incense in the temple. The priests burn incense in the temple. The ceremony associated with that would have the worshippers seated out in the outer court, waiting in breathless silence when the priest went in to burn the incense until he came out again. They remained in prayer. It was called the time of incense. It was also called the time of prayer. They would be praying outside while the priest was inside burning the incense. And it was a time of silence. You remember, that was the scene when Zacharias, who became the father of John the Baptist, the priest went into the temple. He went to burn incense. And he saw the angel there, and he was struck dumb, and there was this conversation. He lingered longer than they expected in the temple. And it says outside the people were in prayer at the time of incense, waiting for him to come out and wondering what had become of him. This is probably what the silence in heaven is about. It corresponds to the time, the silence and prayerful time during which the priest burned incense in the temple. And here we have an angel in heaven burning incense, but it's all highly symbolic because earlier in chapter 5 and verse 8, we read, "Now when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each having a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints." The golden bowls of incense in chapter 5 verse 8 are the prayers of the saints. Here in chapter 8 and verse 4, the incense goes up with the prayers of the saints. So it seems to be sort of a slightly shifted image. The incense was the prayers of the saints in chapter 5 verse 8. Here it is seemingly somehow distinguished from the prayers of the saints. However, it goes up at the same time. In any case, for whatever reason the imagery changes, we can see that in both cases the incense going up represents the offering up of the saints' prayers to God. And the result of their prayers being heard is that fire from the altar is taken and thrown on the earth. Therefore, we must assume that the prayers are imprecatory prayers, such as those that we read of the souls under the altar. As a matter of fact, remember the souls under the altar said, "How long before you avenge our blood?" He said, "A little while, just wait a little while." Perhaps this is the fulfillment of that little while. Now, we get to see some action. The 7 seals have been broken. The book begins to open, the judgment starts to be executed. You say, if this is the beginning of the execution of judgment, what was all that activity in the previous portion? I don't know. Just another way of looking at the same thing. I believe there's many parallels in the book of Revelation. I believe that the 7 bowls and the 7 trumpets and the 7 seals, all in their own way, describe the judgment of the same period. And it's as though the theme is reworked several times. Now, don't be surprised at that. You remember when Joseph was in prison in Egypt, and Pharaoh had 2 dreams. One was of 7 fat cows, and out of the river came 7 skinny cows that ate up the fat cows. And then he saw 7 ears of grain, fat ears of grain, and they were eaten up by 7 blighted, skinny ears of grain. Remember when Joseph gave the interpretation, he said, the dream is, you had 2 dreams, but the dream is really one. God gave it to you twice just to establish it, so you'd know the word was established. But really, the 7 ears of grain are the same as the 7 cows. And the 2 dreams, though they were 2 different sets of images, were really the same story, told twice. And likewise, as I pointed out earlier, in Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream of this image with a head of gold, a chest of silver, a belly of brass, and legs of iron. They represented 4 successive Gentile empires. In Daniel 7, Daniel has a vision of 4 beasts, a lion, a bear, a leopard, and another indescribably ferocious beast. These tended, as it proves from reading the interpretation, they represented the same 4 kingdoms, represented the metals. In other words, it's not unlike God to say the same thing twice using different images. Therefore, I think we are to see, as far as trying to follow the story of the book of Revelation, these trumpets are the result of the opening of the book. But if we ask, why did we see all that activity when each seal was being broken? I think for dramatic effect. I think it basically gave us a preview of the kinds of things that were about to break forth. I think it was basically telling the same story in advance with different images, and now we're going to see it again another way. That's my opinion. I could be wrong. But it's interesting that in the breaking of the 5th seal, the souls of the martyrs were seen asking, how long till you avenge us? Now we see the angel taking their prayers and offering them up to God, and the result is he is authorized now to take this fire from the same altar of which the prayers were offered from and cast it on the earth in the form of judgment. And that judgment is seen in the blowing of 7 trumpets. The symbolism of this opening vision is that the prayers of the saints are offered before God like incense, and he responds by judging those who were their oppressors and their slayers. Now, again, it's something against our grain to think of, praying for someone to die or praying for someone to be judged or something, and it certainly is not what we pray on a regular basis, and it certainly should not be something that reflects antagonism toward our persecutors. We are to love those who persecute us, bless them, and so forth. At the same time, the church is regularly praying for God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. And that, in order to be fulfilled, will require either the conversion or the elimination of those who are not doing the will of God. Every time you pray, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, you are implying either that those who are not doing God's will all be converted, or else at least the ones who are not will be eliminated. Now, we don't think of that as an imprecatory prayer at the time, but that's what it amounts to. Before God's will can really be done on earth, which is what every Christian craves, there's got to be something done with respect to those who are not doing the will of God and those who are opposing the will of God. Some of them will be converted, the rest of them will be judged. And that prayer is asking that whatever God's going to do, he does it quickly. And so it is not unlike the church to pray that God will set things right, as I said earlier. And we have to understand that the book of Revelation is set in the mode of a trial. That God is finally vindicating those innocent victims of martyrdom and bringing the righteous judgment that they've wondered when it was going to come. And, so this is what happens. So we have the 7 trumpets about to break loose. Verse 7. The first angel sounded, and hail and fire followed, mingled with blood. And they were thrown to the earth, and 1/3 of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. Now all the grass is burned up, but later on the locusts are told not to hurt the grass. Of course, after grass is burned up, I guess a new generation of grass could come up, but also I think we have to understand this is essentially symbolic of something. What is it symbolizing? Well, let's read the whole section, okay? The first 4 trumpets are treated in chapter 8, and then chapter 9 gives somewhat more lengthy treatment of the 5th and the 6th trumpets. And as I said, the 7th trumpet waits till chapter 11 to be blown after an interlude. But we see the first trumpet results in hail and fire, reminiscent of the 4th plague of Egypt. There was hail with fire that ran along the ground in Exodus 9:23 through 26. Remember, the fall of Jerusalem is likened to the destruction of Egypt in Revelation. Jerusalem is spiritually called Egypt and Sodom. And therefore images from when God judged Egypt in the old days are rebirthed in this book as symbols of God's judgment on now the spiritual Egypt, which is Jerusalem, which is so ironic because when he judged the real Egypt, he did it to vindicate Israel. He did it to save Israel. However, they have now shown them that he did it to establish the old covenant. He brought them out of Egypt and gave them the law and established the first covenant. Now he's destroying the old covenant. He's replacing it with a new covenant. And just as the first covenant was made on the ruins of Egypt, as it were, so the new covenant is established on the ruins of that spiritual Egypt which Israel had become. And so, as God judged Egypt with plagues, so we see the plagues chosen to be part of this revelation are borrowed, almost all of them are borrowed from the story of the Exodus. Here it's blood. There was blood mingled, the rivers turned to blood in Egypt, hail and fire. The result is a third of the trees are burned up, all the green grass is burned up. Then the second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and the third of the sea became blood, and a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Then the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. And the name of the star was wormwood, which simply means bitterness. And a third of the waters became wormwood, or bitterness, and many men died from the water because it was bitter. Then the fourth, remember something in the Bible about bitter water? When the Jews were brought out of Egypt, they came to Marah, the place of bitter water, and God turned the water sweet for them by throwing a piece of wood in it. That's right. Here's a burning torch, a piece of wood, throwing in the water. It turns the waters bitter. The burning of the piece of wood, no doubt, represents judgment, since fire is often an emblem of judgment. But it's sort of a reverse of what God did for the Jews when he brought them out of Egypt. He threw a piece of wood in the water, and it made the bitter waters sweet. That was back in Exodus chapter 15. 15, isn't it? I think it's 15.
That's Song of Moses. Yes, right.
At the end of it. Yeah, the end of that chapter. And now here we have the opposite happening. A stick is thrown into the waters that makes them bitter, and people are dying from it. Then the fourth, and by the way, oh gosh, I can't resist the temptation. I'll wait. Let me just read these and I'll comment on each one individually. Then the fourth angel sounded, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars. Hey, they all kind of disappeared back when the sixth seal went up. What's going on here? Well, obviously we're not to take this overly literally. This is for effect. This is to get across a powerful message of God's destructive power in judging. So that a third of them were darkened, and a third of the day did not shine, and likewise the night. And I looked, and I heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, "Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth," or of the land, because of the remaining blasts of the trumpet of the three angels who are about to sound. Now, the three last trumpets were each called woes. After he blows the next trumpet, it says, "One woe is past," verse 12 of chapter 9, and two more woes are coming. And then later on, after the next trumpet is blown, it says, two woes are past and one more is coming. So each of the last three trumpets are called woes because of their increased intensity. These first four only affected a third of everything, which means a significant minority. Not a statistical third, but it's not total destruction yet. We're not looking at total destruction. The war of the Jews began up in Galilee. It took almost 3 years for the Romans to get as far south as they needed to besiege Jerusalem in 70 AD. First, they started in the most remote northern area, and they came in from the north, and they started destroying the cities of Galilee, and then down through Samaria, and then down to Judah, and finally to Jerusalem. So the whole country wasn't utterly devastated at first. It started out with, pretty bad stuff. But the really bad stuff was saved for later. The worst was last. I think that the woes have to do with what happened when Jerusalem was under siege. But before that, these other things are affecting a third of the land, a third of the people of the land, which would be the land of Israel. Now, another interesting thing before I talk about these 4 trumpets individually is the 7 trumpets recall a story from the Old Testament. When the Jews came into Canaan, the first city they came against was Jericho. And they had their trumpets. And they marched around the city 7 times, once a day for 7 days. And then on the 7th day they marched across around 7 times. And then they blew their trumpets. This succession of 7s and the stress on the trumpets is perhaps recalled here with these 7 trumpets that are sounded. And as Jerusalem is spiritually called Sodom, which was a Canaanite city, it may be that the suggestion here is it's also not any better than Jericho, which was another Canaanite city. The fall of Jerusalem is as the result of blowing these trumpets, just as Jericho fell by the blowing of trumpets. Now let's look at the individual trumpet blasts. The first one basically affected the vegetation. A third of the trees, verse 7, were burned up. A third of all the green grass was burned up. There's an interesting passage, not surprisingly, in Josephus, of all places, about possibly about this. It's on page 727. It's in the Wars of the Jews, book 6, chapter 1, paragraph 1. Near the end of paragraph 1. It's book 6, chapter 1, paragraph 1. Found on page 727. Josephus is talking about when the Romans made an assault upon the Tower of Antonia, which was actually in Jerusalem. He said, and now the Romans, although they were greatly distressed in getting together their materials, raised their banks in 21 days, that is their siege works around the city, after they had cut down all the trees that were in the country that adjoined to the city, and that for 90 furlongs round about, as I have already related. And truly, the very view itself of the country was a melancholy thing. For those places which were before adorned with trees and pleasant gardens were now become a desolate country every way, and its trees were all cut down. Nor could any foreigner that had formerly seen Judea and the most beautiful suburbs of the city, and now saw it as a desert, but lament and mourn sadly at so great a change, for the war had laid all signs of beauty quite waste. Now, this is related to the siege of Jerusalem, that the Romans cut down the trees to make siege works. Later on, we're going to see all the trees destroyed in the 7 bowls that are poured out, and I think that probably has to do with Jerusalem. These judgments, the first 4 trumpets, I believe, are not directly on Jerusalem, but on the land of Israel. Because, as I said, the judgment began at the northern end of the land and came down finally to Jerusalem 3 years later. But if this happened at Jerusalem, it should not be surprising that the Romans did similar things in the cities of Galilee and so forth. When they besieged them, they must have made siege works and so forth, and therefore we can deduce, we can't be absolutely certain, and I don't want to be dogmatic, but I think it's fair to suggest that if the Romans did this at Jerusalem, they probably did this kind of thing elsewhere. And therefore, we see, as the result of the Roman invasion, trees, a number of trees, not all of them, a significant minority of trees, destroyed. The place is being denuded. By the way, that is done, that in warfare, in ancient times, that was often done, not only for the sake of siege works, but just out of malice. In fact, during the Korean War, when the Japanese came into Korea, they cut down all the trees. Korea had beautiful forests and trees. You go there today, you won't find any trees in Korea that are over, what, is it 40 years old or so? When was the Korean War? They have only young trees there. When we were there, the Koreans told us about this. Notice you don't have any big trees in Korea because the Japanese, just to be malicious, cut down all the trees to destroy the beauty of the place. The Jews were told in the 17th chapter, I think it is, no, the 20th chapter of Deuteronomy, where God gives instructions about how they conduct their battles. He told them they can cut down trees for siege work, but don't cut down all the trees. Don't cut down the fruit trees, because those are valuable and so forth. Apparently he had to tell them that because the tendency in old times was just to cut down all the trees. And so it wouldn't be so in our modern wars. If someone would just say, hey, well, this destruction of the trees spoken of here, that had to do with the war. Most modern people say, what's that got to do with war? It has a lot to do with war. The Romans, as well as other ancient armies, would cut down the trees in area, partly out of spite and partly for practical purposes, to build the siege works around the city and break in. And I believe that, though this is not in the trumpet judgment, I don't believe is about Jerusalem. I believe that in the land, which is in view here, we see a denuding of the vegetation and the foliage and the trees in particular. The second trumpet, something interesting happens in connection with the second trumpet. Verse 8, something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea turned to blood. And a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. There's an interesting story in Josephus that may give light on this too. It's in Josephus' Wars of the Jews in Book 3. Book 3, Chapter 10 and paragraph 9. This is on page 663. Listen to this. The Romans, when they were destroying the Galileans, were fled from by the Galileans, and many of them took to boats on the Sea of Galilee to try to cross the Sea of Galilee to escape. But the Romans pursued them in boats and captured them in the middle of the sea and made war with them and slaughtered them in the middle of the sea. And here's what Josephus says. And for such as were drowning in the sea, if they lifted up their heads above the water, they were either killed by darts, meaning arrows, or caught by the vessels. And if, in the desperate case they were in, they attempted to swim to their enemies, the Romans cut off either their heads or their hands. And indeed, they were destroyed after various manners everywhere, till the rest, being put to flight, were forced to get upon the land, while the vessels encompassed them about on the sea. But as many of these were repulsed when they were getting ashore, they were killed by the darts upon the lake. And the Romans leaped out of their vessels and destroyed a great many more upon the land. One might then see the lake, which was the Sea of Galilee, all bloody and full of dead bodies, for not one of them escaped. And a terrible stink and a very sad sight there was on the following days over the country, for as for the shores they were full of shipwrecks, and of dead bodies all swelled, and as the dead bodies were inflamed by the sun and putrefied, they corrupted the air, insomuch that the misery was not only the object of commiseration to the Jews, but to those who hated them and had been the authors of that misery. Isn't that interesting? Josephus, never having read the book of Revelation, not being a Christian, knowing nothing about what John had seen, talks about the sea looked all bloody, and you could see shipwrecks and dead bodies on the seashore. This says, a third of the living creatures in the sea died, a third of the ships were destroyed, the sea became blood. You could hardly ask for a closer verbal parallel than that which Josephus provides to this. This was a war on the Sea of Galilee. By the way, but what is this mountain burning with fire thrown into the sea? Where does that image come from? Let me turn your attention to Matthew chapter 21 for a possible answer to that. Matthew chapter 21. And verse 18 and following. Now in the morning, as he returned to the city, he was hungry. And seeing a fig tree by the road, he came to it and found nothing on it but leaves, and said to it, let no fruit grow on you ever again. And immediately the fig tree withered away. Now when the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, how did the fig tree wither away so soon? And Jesus answered and said to them, assuredly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what is done to the fig tree, but also if you say to this mountain, be removed and be cast into the sea, it will be done. And all things, whatever you ask in prayer, believing, you will receive. I find that a very interesting parallel. Most of you have heard, it is the general opinion of evangelicals, and I think it's correct, that the cursing of the fig tree was symbolic of cursing Israel. That the fig tree in this case represented Israel, And that as Jesus came looking for fruit from Israel, he found none, and therefore said, no one's ever going to bear fruit or eat fruit from you again. By the way, that's very much in keeping with many of the things he said that final week of his life, and this was the beginning of that week. But then when the fig tree was withered up, the disciples said, how'd that happen? Jesus said, if you have faith, you will not only do what is done to this fig tree. He didn't say you can, he said you will. You will not only do what was done to the fig tree, but also if you say to this mountain, Jerusalem was on a mountain and he was just at the foot of it when he spoke this, be removed and cast into the sea, it will be done. Now, of course, we've always understood that just to be a wonderful statement about faith. But when you realize that the burning mountain thrown into the sea in Revelation was in response to the prayers of the saints that were offered up like incense by the angel, it was a response to their imprecatory cries for vengeance, cries for justice. The angel offered up the incense, and one of the things that happened was this mountain was cast into the sea, resulting in judgment on Israel, basically. Now, Jesus had just cursed the fig tree, which almost everybody understands to be a reference to a curse on Israel. And Jesus said to the disciples, you'll do that. You'll do what was done to this fig tree. But not by personally overthrowing it, but by prayer. By their prayers. Not that they were going to pray for, anything bad, but in their prayers like those recorded here. How long will you avenge us? Our blood on those that dwell on the land. Those prayers are going to be heard someday. And believe it or not, this mountain, meaning Jerusalem, Mount Zion, can be thrown into the sea. Not literally, of course. Figuratively. The sea, what does the sea symbolize in prophecy? The Gentile world. What happened to the Jews in 70 AD? The ones that were not slaughtered? They were carried off into the sea, into the Gentile world. They were scattered throughout all the world where they are still today. This mountain was cast into the sea. And that began to happen at the beginning of the Jewish war. One of the phenomena associated with it was the sea turned to blood, as Josephus says. I find that interesting. I don't know if you do or not. Let's turn now to Revelation chapter 8 again. The third angel sounded, verse 10, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. And the name of the star is wormwood, and a third of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the water because it was made bitter. Now, I don't have a quote from Josephus on this particular thing, and therefore I don't know if we can say, anything about how the waters became bitter or how people died from pollution in the waters. But it is not unthinkable that in the siege of certain cities, the Romans might have fouled the water systems, and people might have died from it. It's one of the most important things during siege is to try to either destroy or stop the water supply into the city so that people would be starved out quickly. And that may have happened. I don't know if that happened or not, but it certainly doesn't sound unlike the things that we know did happen. And therefore, that may have literally happened. But I think even more important than that is the symbolism of this. Because, as I mentioned, back in Exodus 15, the Israelites came to bitter waters, which they could not drink. God showed Moses a tree or a stick, and when he threw it in the water, it made sweet water out of it, and they could drink it. And that was symbolic because God said, now this is, let me tell you something. He says, I am the Lord who heals you, just as I healed these bitter waters. And if you will keep my words, if you will do all the things that I command you to do, he says, I will put none of these diseases upon you that I had put upon Egypt. Isn't that something? When God made the bitter waters sweet, he said, if you'll be obedient to me, then you will not ever have to suffer these things that Egypt has suffered at my hands. And that was symbolically described as he had healed their circumstances, their slavery, their bondage. He healed them by bringing them out of Egypt. That was their healing. Just as he had healed the water. The bitterness of the bondage in Egypt is even to this day celebrated by Jews by the bitter herbs on the Passover. The bitter herbs at the table represent the bitterness of bondage. The bitterness of the waters of Marah represented the bondage in Egypt. God sweetened it because they were his people. But he said, listen, obey me. And if you obey me, I promise you won't have to suffer what Egypt suffered. But guess what? They didn't. They never did. And the most disobedient thing they ever did was kill Jesus Christ. And they didn't even turn after that. And so here we see in the judgment that comes upon them, it's time to turn the waters bitter again. And what does that represent? The bondage. It represents bringing the diseases that God had put on Egypt on them. And so it's not surprising that what we read of here is similar to the plagues of Egypt. Although God didn't bring the exact plagues on Israel that he had brought on Egypt, yet the horrible things he brought upon them are in the telling of the story likened to what he did to Egypt. I find that interesting. Now, verse 12. Then the fourth angel sounded, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that the third of them was darkened, and a third of the day it did not shine, and likewise the night. This is like one of the plagues of Egypt also. It resembles the plague of darkness found in Exodus chapter 10, 21 through 23. By the way, I didn't mention it, but when the sea turned to blood and when the second trumpet sounded, that was also like an Egyptian plague, because the water turning to blood was the first plague in Egypt. Anyway, the darkening of the sun, the moon, the stars. This is a third of it. I don't know exactly what to say about the meaning of this, except I will say that when we saw the sixth seal, which I believe represented the total final devastation of Jerusalem, there was the total darkening of the sun, the moon, and the stars, which Jesus also described using those figures in the Olivet Discourse, and Peter did on the day of Pentecost when he quoted Joel and so forth. Maybe this is just to say it's not the complete judgment of which Jesus spoke, but a partial judgment. The beginning of the war of the Jews was the precursor of that total devastation, which would be symbolically the darkening of the sun, moon, and stars. Here we have it symbolically portrayed as a portion of it is done. If we understand the stars and the sun and the moon to refer to the fixed points of the universe, or the things that are stable and thought to endure, and yet they are affected here. So Israel thought of itself as enduring as long as the sun and the moon and the stars. In fact, Isaiah had said something like that if I take away the ordinances of the sun, the moon, and the stars, then I'll also take away you, O Israel, from being a nation before me. And so it's appropriate that when God did take away Israel from being a nation before him, that it is likened to God removing the sun, moon, and stars. But here only partially, because this isn't the total devastation that comes later in the bowl judgments. And the closing verse here, verse 13, and I looked and I heard an angel. The modern translations say an eagle. That represents a difference in manuscripts. But an eagle flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, or of the land, because of the remaining blasts of the trumpet of the three angels that are about to sound. And they are pretty bad when you read about them, especially the locust plague and that's coming up next. Anyway, if eagle is the better rendering there rather than angel, it reminds us of Matthew 24:28, where in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus said, where the corpse is, the eagles will be gathered. Jerusalem was like a corpse, and here's an eagle announcing the doom of that land, of that city. And so the last three of the trumpet blasts are going to be so terrible that they're called woes. And I think it is at that point that we begin to focus on things that happen to Jerusalem. The first is likened to a locust plague. The second is like horses coming. Well, I wish we didn't have to quit here, but we do. And we'll come back to that and go much, hopefully considerably further next time.